Millionaire marries an obese woman as a wager, and is surprised when. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. On a crisp Saturday morning in New York City, the smell of freshly baked bread drifted down a quiet street. Inside a modest bakery with paint peeling slightly from its wooden doorframe, Amelia wiped flour from her round cheeks. She was a woman in her late 20s, with soft eyes and a laugh that warmed the room, though society rarely saw her kindness before they judged her figure. She had inherited this bakery from her late mother, but the bills piled higher than the trays of croissants cooling on the counter. Every day was a battle to keep the ovens hot and the doors open. Meanwhile, across town in a glass tower that touched the clouds, Ethan Whitmore leaned back in a leather chair, sipping his morning espresso. The young millionaire was infamous in high society for his arrogance. He thrived on attention, on winning, on making every gathering a spectacle. At a late-night party crowded with heirs and businessmen, his so-called friends mocked his carefully curated bachelor image. One of them smirked and said, "You claim you can make any woman look like a prize on your arm, Ethan. Why not prove it? Marry someone no one in our circle would ever accept." Laughter erupted, champagne glasses clinked. Fueled by pride and his addiction to winning, Ethan agreed. The bet was sealed with a handshake and smug smiles. He would find a woman, someone far from the perfect socialite image, and marry her. To them it was a cruel joke. To Ethan, it was another game he could not afford to lose. Days later, fate guided him to that very modest bakery. He had not intended to stop, but the scent of cinnamon rolls pulled him inside. There stood Amelia, in her flour-dusted apron, her round figure bent over trays of pastries. She looked up, startled, her hands covered in dough. Ethan's sharp eyes scanned the small space, then landed on her. In that moment, a cruel idea solidified. She was perfect for his wager. "Good morning," he said smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks as though he were closing a deal. "I have a proposal for you." Amelia blinked in confusion, not yet realizing that the stranger before her was a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. When Ethan explained his outrageous offer, a marriage contract in exchange for wiping out her debts, Amelia froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the edge of the counter. She wanted to laugh, to tell him to leave. But the memories of the overdue bank notices stacked on her desk made her throat tighten. This was madness. It was humiliating. But it was also the only lifeline that could save the bakery her mother had built with love. "I am not interested in being part of your joke," Amelia whispered, her voice breaking. But Ethan leaned closer, his tone cool, calculated. "Think carefully. You have bills you cannot pay. I have resources you will never touch otherwise. All I ask is your signature." He slid a pristine contract across the counter, the stark black ink contrasting against the flour-speckled wood. Amelia stared at the paper, then at Ethan's perfectly pressed suit. In her chest, her heart pounded with anger, fear, and something else she could not name. She thought of her mother's handwriting in the old recipe notebook, the one she guarded like treasure. She thought of the customers who still came every morning for her bread, and she thought of losing it all. Against every instinct screaming inside her, Amelia picked up the pen. Amelia's hand hovered above the contract, the pen cold between her fingers. Her bakery smelled of sugar and yeast, a scent that had always comforted her, but in that moment it felt suffocating. She signed her name slowly, each letter pressing into the paper like the weight of a chain. Ethan slid the contract back with a satisfied smirk, as though he had just acquired another property rather than the trust of a woman. That evening, Amelia walked home with a heaviness she had never known. Her apartment above the bakery was small, the wallpaper fading, the ceiling creaking whenever she moved. She looked at her mother's recipe book resting on the counter. The handwriting on those yellowed pages reminded her of warmth and laughter. But tonight, she felt only the coldness of the deal she had made. The next morning, Ethan arrived in a sleek black car that looked out of place on her narrow street. He stepped out, polished shoes tapping against the pavement, and announced that their wedding would be immediate. Amelia blinked, startled. She had expected weeks, maybe months, to prepare herself, but Ethan made it clear that waiting was not an option. To him, it was business. To her, it was a storm she could not escape. At City Hall, Amelia wore a plain cream dress that she had found in the back of her closet. Ethan wore a tailored suit, crisp and gleaming. The clerk looked between them with raised brows, but stamped the papers anyway. When Ethan slipped a simple band onto her finger, Amelia's chest tightened. It was supposed to be symbolic, but it felt more like a lock clicking into place. Ethan leaned closer and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "It is done." The days that followed were a blur. Ethan moved Amelia into his penthouse, a sprawling glass palace overlooking Central Park. For Amelia, it was a world entirely foreign. The floors shone like mirrors, the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, and everywhere she turned she felt like a guest in her own life. Ethan, meanwhile, treated her with a polite distance. He made sure the staff knew their roles. He reminded Amelia to appear at certain dinners, and he corrected her posture when they were out in public. Their first dinner together at home was an awkward silence broken only by the sound of silverware against porcelain. Amelia pushed her food around the plate, overwhelmed by the taste of rich dishes that lacked the comfort of her bakery's bread. Ethan noticed her hesitation and asked with a detached tone, "Do you not like it?" She glanced up, startled by the question, and admitted softly, "I miss the food I cook myself." For a moment, Ethan said nothing, his eyes sharp, calculating. Then he looked away, as if the comment meant nothing. Behind the doors of his office, Ethan laughed with his friends on the phone. They teased him about his new wife, and he played along, boasting about the wager. But when he walked past the kitchen and saw Amelia kneading dough by hand, her hair falling loose from its tie, her hands steady with care, he felt an unfamiliar pause in his chest. She was not glamorous. She was not the image society prized. Yet there was something genuine about the way she poured herself into every movement. One evening, Amelia sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills. Ethan entered, his presence filling the room. She gathered the papers quickly, embarrassed, but he caught sight of them. Instead of offering help, he simply said, "Do not worry about those anymore. I told you, I will take care of it." His words were meant to reassure, but his tone carried the arrogance of a man who thought money could mend anything. Amelia forced a smile, but when he left the room, her eyes welled with tears. She had married him to save her bakery, but in doing so, she feared she had lost something greater, her dignity. She opened her mother's notebook and whispered to herself, this was supposed to be about love, not survival. And yet, as the nights passed in that penthouse, she could not deny the strange shift she felt. Ethan's cold exterior was beginning to crack, just slightly, and Amelia wondered if beneath the wager there was a man who might one day see her not as a contract, but as a partner. The early weeks of their marriage unfolded like a theater performance. Ethan presented Amelia to his wealthy circle as if she were part of a polished act, while Amelia struggled to navigate the rules of a society that never welcomed her. At every dinner party and charity gala, whispers followed her. "Why her?" guests would murmur behind crystal glasses of wine. Some sneered at her weight, others chuckled at her modest background. Ethan pretended not to notice, his jaw clenched, but Amelia heard every word. One evening, she stood beside him at a charity auction in Manhattan. She wore a borrowed gown that clung uncomfortably to her figure. And though she held her head high, her hands trembled around her glass of sparkling water. Ethan's friends gathered nearby, laughing too loudly, their eyes glancing at her with thinly veiled mockery. Amelia wanted to disappear. She felt like an imposter in a glittering world. During the speeches, Amelia accidentally bumped the edge of the stage while stepping back, nearly toppling a tray of champagne flutes. A wave of laughter rippled across the room. Ethan reached out, steadying her arm, his hand firm but steady. For a brief second, his eyes met hers, and Amelia saw something she had not expected. It was not annoyance. It was not mockery. It was concern. He whispered, "Do not mind them." Then he guided her back to her seat. Later that night, when they returned to the penthouse, Amelia retreated to the kitchen, desperate to escape the echo of laughter. She pulled out flour, sugar, and eggs. moving with practiced rhythm. Baking was her refuge, the one place where the world's judgment could not reach her. Ethan walked in, loosened his tie, and paused in the doorway. He watched silently as she mixed ingredients, her movements calm and deliberate. The warm aroma filled the air, and without thinking, he asked, "What are you making?" "Cinnamon bread," she answered softly, not looking up. "It was my mother's recipe. She used to bake it every time I felt small. Somehow, it always made me believe that I mattered." Ethan stepped closer, his expression unreadable. He had spent his life surrounded by wealth and excess, but in that moment, the smell of bread felt richer than any banquet. When the loaf emerged golden from the oven, Amelia sliced a piece and placed it on a plate. She hesitated, then pushed it toward him. Ethan accepted, taking a bite. His eyes widened slightly at the taste. It was simple, yet comforting, like a memory he had never had. For the first time, he thanked her without irony. "It is good," he said quietly. Amelia managed a small smile, but she remained cautious. She reminded herself that this marriage had begun as a game for him. The next day, Amelia returned to the bakery for the first time since moving into the penthouse. Ethan insisted on driving her, though he acted indifferent, scrolling through his phone while the chauffeur navigated the busy streets. When they arrived, Amelia stepped out, breathing in the familiar scent of her shop. The shelves looked emptier than before, the financial strain still visible, but her regular customers greeted her warmly. Ethan lingered near the door, surveying the modest space with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. An elderly customer approached Amelia and whispered, "We missed you, dear. The bakery is not the same without your touch." Amelia's eyes softened, but when she glanced at Ethan, she saw him watching closely. He seemed unsettled by the way people respected her here, in this simple place, far from his skyscraper world. That evening, as they rode back to the penthouse, Amelia dared to ask, "Why did you choose me, Ethan?" He turned his gaze toward the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "Because you were different," he replied, his tone clipped. But when he faced her again, his expression had shifted. "And maybe because I knew you would not bow to them the way others do." Amelia sat in silence, her heart torn between anger and an unfamiliar flicker of hope. For all his arrogance, there was a part of Ethan she could not quite decipher. A part that looked at her not as a wager, but as someone who challenged the walls he had built around himself. And though Amelia would never admit it aloud, she began to wonder if the chains that bound them together could one day turn into something real. The weeks passed, and Amelia's life became a strange blend of two worlds. By day, she worked in her bakery, hands dusted with flour, sleeves rolled up, pouring her heart into dough and sugar. By night, she was expected to attend dinners, galas, and meetings by Ethan's side, dressed in borrowed gowns and painted with the brush of society's judgment. The contrast left her exhausted, but it also revealed truths about Ethan that she could not ignore. One evening, Ethan returned late from the office, his tie undone, his eyes heavy. Amelia had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, her head resting on her arms beside a half-finished pie. The oven was still warm, the sweet scent of apples filling the air. Ethan stood silently for a long moment, watching her. She looked peaceful, untouched by the cruel world that mocked her. He reached out, gently covering her with a blanket before retreating to his own room. He told himself it was nothing, but something stirred in his chest that he could not name. Their fragile bond grew in small moments. When Amelia cooked breakfast, Ethan sometimes sat with her, sipping coffee, while she hummed a tune her mother once sang. When she returned from the bakery, he occasionally asked about her day, though he masked his curiosity with indifference. She noticed the change in his eyes, however. The arrogance had softened, replaced by a flicker of something warmer. Still, the world outside did not let them forget what tied them together. At another grand charity ball, Amelia faced relentless whispers once again. She tried to focus on the speeches, but the sting of laughter pressed into her skin like 1,000 needles. This time, however, Ethan did not remain silent. When a socialite made a cruel remark about Amelia's weight, Ethan's sharp voice cut through the room. "Enough," he said firmly, his hand tightening around Amelia's. "If you have nothing meaningful to contribute, then you have no place here." The room fell quiet, stunned. For the first time, Ethan defended her publicly, and Amelia's heart thudded in her chest. She looked at him with wide eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the man beneath the arrogance, a man who could stand for justice when he chose to. That night, in the limousine ride home, silence filled the space between them. But it was a silence charged with something new. Back at the penthouse, Amelia found herself baking again, as if to calm her racing heart. Ethan appeared in the doorway, loosening his collar. He watched her work, the rhythmic kneading of dough, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Finally, he stepped forward. "Teach me," he said, his voice lower than usual. Amelia looked up, surprised. "Teach you what?" "To bake," Ethan answered simply. She blinked, then handed him a ball of dough. At first, he fumbled, his expensive cufflinks catching flour, his hands clumsy. Amelia laughed softly, the sound like a melody in the quiet kitchen. For the first time since their contract began, the weight on her chest lightened. They stood side by side, rolling dough, their laughter mingling with the hum of the oven. Later that night, as they shared the warm bread at the table, Ethan studied her face in the soft glow of the kitchen light. Amelia caught his gaze and quickly looked away, but her cheeks flushed. She felt something shift deep inside her, something she was afraid to name. In the days that followed, Ethan began to join her at the bakery more often. At first, he claimed it was to ensure his investment was not wasted. But Amelia noticed the way he listened when customers praised her pastries. He even rolled up his sleeves once, helping her lift heavy trays. His presence in that modest shop was awkward, yet strangely comforting. And in those fleeting, ordinary moments, Amelia began to believe that perhaps their marriage, born out of cruelty and pride, might be transforming into something neither of them had expected. Something fragile, something real. The city's social calendar was relentless, and before long another grand event loomed. This time it was a charity gala hosted at a lavish hotel ballroom, walls dripping with gold chandeliers and tables set with crystal glassware. Ethan insisted that Amelia attend with him, though she hesitated. The memory of cruel laughter at previous parties still stung her, but something inside her urged her to stand tall. She refused to let their judgment define her. When the night arrived, Amelia wore a gown she had altered herself, sewing late into the evening with determination. It was not designer, but it carried her touch, her dignity. As she stepped into the ballroom, she could feel dozens of eyes fix on her. Some narrowed with disdain, others widened with curiosity. Ethan walked confidently at her side, his hand resting lightly against her back. For once, he did not seem embarrassed by her presence. During the dinner, whispers began again. Amelia heard them, the cruel remarks cloaked as humor. But this time, instead of shrinking, she stood. When a man made a mocking comment about her weight, she looked directly at him, her voice calm yet strong. "A body is not a measure of worth," she said. "Character is, and I would rather be remembered for kindness than for cruelty." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the clinking of silverware ceased. Ethan watched her, his chest tightening with something he could not explain. He had expected her to falter, to hide, but instead she had spoken with dignity that silenced an entire room. Pride, genuine and unfamiliar, swelled inside him. Without hesitation, he placed his hand over hers and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "My wife is right. If anyone here disagrees, then perhaps you should look in the mirror before casting judgment." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes. Others whispered in disapproval, but a few clapped softly, moved by Amelia's courage. For the first time, Ethan realized he did not care about the opinions of those around him. What mattered was the woman standing beside him, the woman who carried herself with more grace than anyone in that ballroom. Later that night, as the car carried them home, Amelia stared out at the glittering city lights. Her heart still pounded from the confrontation, but she felt stronger than she had in years. Ethan broke the silence. "You surprised me tonight," he said quietly. She turned to him, cautious. "Why? Did you expect me to stay silent?" He shook his head. "I expected you to hide, but you did not. You faced them all." His voice softened. "And I admired it." Amelia blinked, unsure how to respond. For a man who thrived on arrogance, those words sounded almost vulnerable. When they returned to the penthouse, Amelia went straight to the kitchen. Baking had always been her anchor. She pulled out her mother's recipe book and began mixing flour. Ethan entered, loosening his tie and leaned against the counter. "You know," he said, "you did not need to prove yourself tonight. You already matter." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Amelia's hands froze over the bowl. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw sincerity where arrogance had once been. She handed him a spoonful of the batter. He tasted it, his lips curving into a rare smile. "It is perfect," he said. Amelia's heart fluttered, though she forced herself to stay composed. "It is not finished yet," she replied softly. He met her eyes, his gaze lingering. "Neither are we." The clock ticked past midnight, the kitchen warm with the scent of cinnamon. For the first time since signing that cruel contract, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope. Something inside Ethan was changing. And though she feared the truth of how their marriage had begun, she wondered if perhaps it could transform into something real. The fragile bond that had begun to form between Ethan and Amelia was soon tested in the harshest way. One crisp autumn afternoon, Amelia returned to the penthouse from the bakery, still wearing her flour-stained apron. She opened the door to hear laughter echoing from the living room. Ethan's old friends were gathered there, glasses of whiskey in hand, their suits impeccable, their eyes sharp with arrogance. Amelia froze in the doorway as one of the men chuckled loudly. "I still cannot believe you actually went through with it, Ethan. A wager is one thing, but to keep her around for this long? Truly impressive commitment to a joke." The words crashed into Amelia's chest like a blade. Her hands trembled, the bag of fresh bread she carried slipping from her fingers onto the polished floor. The laughter grew louder, careless, cruel. She looked at Ethan, waiting for him to deny it, to silence them as he had done at the gala. But Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence heavier than any insult. Her heart pounded, her throat burned. The truth unraveled before her eyes. The marriage that had saved her bakery. The strange kindness that had begun to bloom between them. Was it all rooted in a cruel bet? Amelia turned sharply, tears stinging her eyes, and fled to the bedroom. Ethan excused himself, his face pale, and followed quickly. He found her clutching her mother's recipe notebook against her chest, her body trembling. She looked at him with eyes filled with hurt. "Tell me it is not true," she whispered. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. His silence was the confirmation she dreaded. Amelia's tears spilled over. "All of this, every moment, was just a game to you?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. "Amelia, listen," Ethan tried, stepping forward, but she backed away. "Do not come closer. You do not get to use my heart as a wager," she cried. With shaking hands, she reached for the contract that had once bound them and tore it in half, the paper splitting with a sharp rip that echoed through the room. "This was never a marriage. It was a transaction. And I am done." She shoved past him, running down the hall. Ethan stood frozen, the torn contract at his feet, the weight of his choices crushing him. For the first time, he felt powerless. The arrogance that had carried him through every deal, every game, every challenge, was gone. All that remained was regret. Amelia returned to the bakery that night, tears staining her cheeks as she unlocked the familiar door. The small shop, though quiet, felt safer than the cold penthouse ever had. She sat at the counter, clutching her recipe notebook, and whispered to her mother's memory, "I should never have signed that contract. I traded my dignity for survival, and I lost myself." Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone in the penthouse, the silence deafening. His friends had left, their laughter still haunting his ears. He stared at the torn contract, the symbol of his arrogance, and realized he had destroyed the only thing that had ever felt real in his life. For the first time, the millionaire who once believed money could fix anything understood that no amount of wealth could mend the wound he had inflicted. Days passed, and Amelia refused to answer his calls. She poured herself into her bakery, but even the sweet scent of fresh bread could not fill the ache in her chest. Every recipe she touched reminded her of the nights Ethan had stood beside her, clumsily kneading dough, laughing despite himself. She hated that she missed him. And Ethan, haunted by her absence, finally knew that if he wanted to make things right, it would not be through wealth or status. It would require humility, truth, and a love that was no longer a wager, but a choice. Ethan's world unraveled quickly after Amelia left. The penthouse felt empty, its polished glass and marble echoing with silence. For years he had thrived on business victories, expensive cars, and exclusive parties. But now none of it carried meaning. He stared at the torn contract on his desk, its jagged edges reminding him of the wound he had inflicted. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized that money could not erase shame. The press caught wind of the wager, and the story spread like wildfire. Headlines splashed across tabloids. Millionaire marries as a joke. Cruel bet exposed. Shareholders questioned his character, and business partners began to distance themselves. Ethan could not hide anymore. He was forced to confront the damage he had done, not only to Amelia but also to himself. Determined to make things right, Ethan called for a press conference. Cameras flashed as reporters crowded into the hall, their voices buzzing with anticipation. Ethan stepped to the podium, his suit immaculate, but his face stripped of arrogance. For once, he did not try to charm or impress. His voice carried raw honesty. Yes, the wager was real, he admitted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was cruel, and it was wrong. I hurt a woman who did not deserve it, a woman whose heart and dignity are worth more than all the wealth in this city. I was a fool to treat love as a game. I was blind to the kindness and strength she showed me every day. Amelia is not a bet. She is the best thing that has ever walked into my life. The confession sent shockwaves across the media. Some mocked him for weakness, but others praised his courage to speak the truth. For Ethan, it did not matter. He had finally spoken from his heart instead of his pride. That evening, he went to Amelia's bakery. The shop glowed softly in the night, the smell of bread drifting through the air. He saw her inside, wiping down counters, her hair tied back, her movements steady. For a moment he hesitated, afraid she would turn him away. But he pushed the door open, the small bell above chiming. Amelia looked up, her eyes narrowing when she saw him. She said nothing, only crossed her arms. Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but firm. I told the world the truth. I do not care about the wager or the business or what society thinks of me. I care about you. Her lips trembled, but she shook her head. You humiliated me, Ethan. You broke everything we had. He nodded, pain flashing across his face. I know, and I will spend the rest of my life proving I am not that man anymore. Amelia turned away, her hands gripping the counter. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unfinished words. Ethan did not push further. He simply placed her recipe notebook on the counter. She gasped, realizing he had taken it by accident the night she left. He opened it gently, revealing a page he had written in his own hand. The words read, Our recipe, love, trust, and forgiveness. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she saw not the arrogant millionaire, but a man stripped of pride, asking not for victory, but for redemption. Amelia's eyes lingered on the handwritten words in her recipe notebook. Her chest tightened, torn between anger and the undeniable pull of sincerity in Ethan's voice. For weeks she had steeled her heart against him, but now here he was, not as the arrogant millionaire who had mocked her life, but as a man stripped bare, vulnerable in a way she had never imagined. Words are easy, Ethan, she said quietly, her voice trembling. What makes this different? Why should I believe you now? Ethan stepped closer, his tone steady, his eyes fixed on hers. Because I am not here to buy forgiveness. I am here to earn it. I do not want to fix this with money or promises. I want to fix it with action. He took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and walked behind the counter. Amelia stared in shock as he reached for the sack of flour. What are you doing? She asked, unable to mask her disbelief. Showing you, Ethan replied. If you will let me, I want to stand where you stand. I want to understand the life you built, not the one I tried to control. With clumsy hands, Ethan poured flour onto the counter. It scattered across his expensive shirt, but he did not care. Amelia watched as he struggled to knead the dough, pressing too hard, then too soft, grimacing as it stuck to his fingers. For a moment, she almost laughed, remembering the night he had first asked her to teach him. But this was different. This was not curiosity. This was desperation, a plea for redemption. Finally, he looked at her, breathless. Help me, he said. Amelia hesitated, then stepped beside him. Her hands guided his, steadying his movements. Together they worked the dough, side by side, their rhythm awkward at first but slowly finding harmony. The kitchen filled with silence, broken only by the soft thud of dough against the counter. When the bread was ready, Ethan insisted on waiting with her until it baked, refusing to leave her side. As the oven's warmth filled the room, Amelia studied his face in the golden light. For the first time, she saw not the polished mask of wealth, but the man beneath, flawed, determined, and willing to kneel if it meant earning her forgiveness. When the bread emerged, Ethan broke it in half and offered her a piece. "Not perfect," he admitted, his voice low, "but real. Just like me, just like us." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. She took the bread, her fingers brushing against his. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a whisper, she answered, "This is the first step, Ethan." Nothing more. Relief flickered across his face, and for the first time in weeks, hope returned to his eyes. He knew she had not forgiven him yet, but she had opened a door, and that was enough for him to keep fighting. The days that followed were not easy. Trust, once broken, was not mended overnight. Ethan showed up at the bakery every morning, not in a suit and tie, but in rolled-up sleeves, helping Amelia sweep the floors, knead the dough, and greet customers. At first the townspeople watched in disbelief. Some whispered, others mocked. But gradually they began to see something different in the once arrogant millionaire. He was not above scrubbing pans or carrying flour sacks. He worked beside Amelia with quiet persistence, proving his words through action. One Saturday, the bakery was busier than ever. Customers filled the small shop, praising Amelia's pastries and even complimenting Ethan for his clumsy but earnest effort behind the counter. An elderly woman smiled warmly at them both and said, "This is what marriage looks like, partnership." Amelia's heart stirred. She glanced at Ethan, who wiped flour from his brow, his eyes meeting hers with a softness she had never seen before. That evening, after the last customer left and the ovens cooled, Ethan approached her with something in his hands. It was her mother's recipe notebook, carefully preserved. He opened to the page where he had written before and added a new line beneath it: "Our future, love, trust, and justice." He looked at her earnestly and said, "No contracts, no wagers, no conditions, only us." Amelia's eyes filled with tears. For so long she had feared that her worth would always be measured against her size, against society's cruel standards. But here was a man who had once mocked love, now standing vulnerable, asking not for a transaction, but for her heart. She thought of her mother's legacy, of the bakery, of every moment that had brought them here. Slowly, Amelia placed her hand over his. "Then let us begin again, not as a wager, as a choice." Ethan exhaled deeply, as though a weight had lifted. He drew her into his arms, not with arrogance, but with tenderness. The bakery, once filled with the noise of judgment, now echoed with the quiet promise of a love born from pain but rebuilt with truth. And so, the millionaire and the baker, who began as a cruel bet, stood side by side, not in a contract of convenience, but in a marriage of love and justice, a testament that true worth is never measured in wealth, but in the courage to change and the heart to forgive.